Hey everyone, and welcome to the Replay PC's YouTube channel. I'm Stu, I'll be your host, and today we're talking about sound modules like the Roland MT-32 and SC-55, and more specifically, different ways that you've got of connecting them up. Now, I know what you're thinking. There's plenty of other content out there on YouTube and forum posts and that sort of thing. Well, I'm hoping that I do have a few different ideas I haven't seen elsewhere, and that I'm able to put a lot of things together in kind of all in one place, because I haven't seen anything quite as comprehensive yet as I'm hoping this to be. So I hope that you get something out of it. As always, if you like what you see, please give us a thumbs up, click that subscribe button, and if you've got any differing opinions or anything that you think I've missed out on, please do leave a comment. So let's get started. So today I've got the MT-32 here, and rather than dig into my stack to pull the SC-55 out, I've got my SC-155 here, which is basically the same. It's just got the additional editing buttons and channel sliders here, but most importantly, all the connections around the back are still the same. So for this video, I am going to be assuming that you've already sorted out one of these, which is your MIDI cable to go from your sound card out to get MIDI into one of your modules. Now, this is just a cheap one that I bought from eBay. I think I paid something like $25 delivered from China. It certainly looks the part with these nice solid metal connections, but two problems. Firstly, the ins and outs weren't labeled, so I had to try and figure out which one was which and then mark the out there. But more importantly is that whilst it looks the piece, it doesn't actually have any of the opto-isolation circuitry or resistors in there that a proper MIDI cable should. So interestingly, whilst this does work on the Sound Blaster cards, it doesn't work on things like your ESS audio drive and probably things like, say, the Yamaha Audition and so on. So don't use it. Instead, you want to try and get yourself one of these. This appears to be a clone, pretty much identical to the original Sound Blaster MIDI cables that we used in the 90s. I got this from OS PC Market. I think that I paid like $14, $15 or something like this, so it was actually cheaper, but once you added on postage, it was about the same. But much better quality cable, does have the ins and outs labeled, and whilst I haven't, cracked open this big connector to see what's inside because I don't want to ruin the cable, it does work on both the Sound Blaster card and also the ESS cards that I've tried, so I'm assuming that it is a proper cable, not just that straight through one. Alright, so I'm also going to assume that you've got yourself, a heap of audio cables. Things like this are really important. Your RCA to 3.5mm jack adapter, plenty of RCA cables, and things like these little guys come in very handy. That's the RCA to 1/4-inch jack adapter that you're going to need for things like the MT-32 or CM32 type modules. Or you can always make up your own cables or adapters that way. So I'll leave all of that to you. That's not the focus of this video. The focus is really, I've got 4 different methods for connecting up your MIDI and your audio. And in a nutshell, those 4 methods are, you've got the manual method, the switch method, daisy chaining, and fourthly, mixing. A mixer. So obviously, you're going to think, well, I want to mix together the digital audio and the music, the output from the modules. So I'm going to need an audio mixer, right? And yes, that's just the logical progression of thought, that you're going to need an audio mixer. And that is the 4th option, and what I regard to be the best option. And I'll cover that shortly, but I'll also be going into a lot more detail in my next video about that. Firstly, though, the first 3 options, if you don't have an audio mixer, the first 3 options, you'll very commonly have basically people just using the line in of your sound card. That's where your RCA to 3.5mm jack adapter comes in handy. You plug it into your line in and use the onboard mixer of the sound card. Pretty much advantages there are that it's cheap and it's easy, it's kind of foolproof. Disadvantages though are that it's lower quality. You're relying upon the inferior mixer of the sound card, and you'll be using a DOS utility to set the line in level. Then it's a matter of using the volume control on your speakers and the sound module itself to adjust the relative balances during the game. But moving on, the first method of connecting up your audio, it's kind of almost not worth mentioning, and that is what I call the manual method. But the reason I do mention it is because it leads me into a point about a disadvantage that applies to more. But obviously the one option is simply, if you want to use your MT-32, you have the audio connected to the MT-32. Same thing with the MIDI. And when you want to switch over to a game that is using the SC-55, you're going to have that one connected instead. So what we're looking at here is pretty much minimum cost, maximum inconvenience. The other disadvantage that I wanted to mention here is that applies to a lot of the other methods too, is you need to know, especially if you're only running MIDI into one of the modules, you need to know which one you're going to be using. So you need to be able to remember for exactly which game you're going to play, how you've configured it, particularly if it's a game that supports both the MT-32 and general MIDI. For example, some of your later Sierra games or something like Prince of Persia 2, if you fire it up when you've got it set to general MIDI and you've got the MT-32 plugged in, you're going to need to start the game all over again, because you can't just unplug one and plug it into the other one. But of course, you know, you generally don't switch from one game to another all the time. You're going to play that game, the next day you're going to come back and play that same game again. So whilst it's not a huge disadvantage, it is worth mentioning because it applies to some of the other methods as well. So the second one is to go for an AV switch like this. This is the sort of thing that we all ran in the 90s when we ran out of inputs on our TV and we wanted to connect game consoles and VCRs and those sorts of things. Just a simple AV switch. You don't need to worry about the video channel. You can use them just with the audio. The important thing is to get one that is a break before make connection, which most of them probably are anyway. This one certainly is. You can hear it when you change the connection. If you heard 2 clicks then, that first click is breaking the connection and the second one is making the new connection. So what that means is that you're not going to inadvertently connect any of the outputs from your modules together and risk damaging your gear. It's not likely to damage it anyway, but just it's a better idea to be safe. Advantages and disadvantages of this. Firstly, it's cheap. It's easy to mute something, particularly if you're not using all of the inputs, or even if you are, because with this one you can push the button halfway to disconnect it. Nothing's connected, we've got no output. Easy mutes, you've got, it's kind of foolproof. It's a little bit scalable because most of them will support, you know, sort of 3-4 inputs. Disadvantages though is, you know, it's still a bit manual, and also that you are really only having the audio from one module. Whilst that doesn't matter where you've just got the classic pairing, if you do add more general MIDI modules later on down the track, which a lot of us do, it's nice to be able to have more than one module active at once. I'll get into that once I start talking about the mixer option. So the next one is what we call daisy chaining, and this one, what you're going to do instead is connect the audio output of your MT-32 into the input here on your SC-55. Now, this works, but your SC-55 needs to be turned on. Oh, and your output obviously of the SC-55 is going to your sound card. So advantages and disadvantages here are that it's cheap. Again, it's even cheaper than the switch box because you don't need a switch box and you're running less cables. Disadvantages are though the SC-55 does need to be turned on, and the volume control of the SC-55 affects the input as well. So what that means is, in order to be using your MT-32, the SC-55 needs to be turned on. Chances are you're going to have MIDI going into the SC-55 as well. The SC-55 will be playing the same MIDI track that is going into it, and all the instruments are going to be wrong because it's composed for the MT-32. It's going to sound terrible. You can't just turn down the volume because that affects the input here. So if I use my SC-55 here, you'll hit the all button and then you'll hit the mute button, which mutes all of the parts but still allows that audio from the input to go through. Not really a problem. The other disadvantage, however, is that this only really works for this pairing. If you do go for more modules, you need to make sure that every single module has got inputs and outputs on it, just like the SC-55 does, in order to be able to chain more and more of them together. Then you're going to have more of a problem with multiple modules to mute and so on. But however, for the classic pairing, this is a very, very common option that a lot of people go for. So that leads me on to the final option, and that is running an audio mixer, which is really the best option in my opinion, and numerous reasons for that. But first of all, I'll say don't go for something like this. This is just a little cheapy passive mixer, doesn't require any power. All of the inputs on this are connected to each other and connected to the output, and all it is some little, you know, variable resistors, potentiometers in there with no protection or isolation between anything. It works, but you risk damaging your gear, so again, I would not use that. Now, if you're going for the complete beige retro thing and you've got yourself, say like the CM-32 or some of the other CM modules, or an SC-7, some of those classic beige, like the 88ST I think comes in a beige as well, and if you're running a set of the Roland MA8s, you want to have the full Roland suite, then you can get yourself one of these. This is the little Roland MX-5, which basically has 5 stereo channels into it, which means it's got a total of 10 inputs. It's actually a 10 channel mixer, because when we're talking about, and again I'll go into more details in my next video, when we're talking about mixer channels, a channel is either left or right. It's a mono channel. So this, strictly speaking, is a 10 channel mixer, but they call it stereo 4-channel mixer plus the auxiliary in here. But this is a lovely little unit if you want to go for that full beige retro look. The disadvantage, of course, here is that all it does pretty much is your volume mixing between them. So you're missing out on some of the possibilities of going for something like this. So this is a little Behringer mixer, and when you're getting into these, you're getting a lot more control over your audio. So obviously, pros and cons of a mixer: you're getting much better sound quality, you're getting more flexibility, and you're getting more inputs and outputs that you can use for recording and all those sorts of things as well. But disadvantages: it costs you a lot more. You're going to be running the mixer, you've got more power requirements, you've got more cables, you've got more stuff going everywhere. And it's another rabbit hole to go down, but that's a lot of fun. I will be going into details, like I said, about mixer choice in the next video, so please do tune in to watch that one. So that leads me on to options for connecting up your MIDI. We've already covered that first one about the manual, and that's the plug and unplug. You can do exactly the same thing with your MIDI setup, that if you're running the MT-32, plug that one in. If you're running the SC-55, plug the next one in. But the other option, the second option, was talking about a switch. Well, the same thing goes with MIDI. Now, this is one that I actually made myself, again with my different requirements. This has got 2 inputs and 3 outputs, or run it the other way around and call it 3 ins and 2 outs. But that's when I was switching between 2 different PCs and 3 different sound modules. They're pretty easy to make up, or you can actually use something like an old KVM switch that's got the 5-pin DIN connection for a keyboard, or even, you know, you can make up some adapters or buy the adapters for 5-pin DIN to the mini DIN for a PS2 connection, or obviously any of those sorts of old data transfer switches will work if you want to go and make up a custom adapter. But by the time you do that kind of soldering, you may as well just buy the components to make a manual switch box like this yourself anyway. Pros and cons: obviously it's a little bit more complicated. You need to run a few more cables, and again the same thing applies with not having to remember which game is using which module. But a switch option like this is another good way of going, just to you know, manually select which module you're going to use. The other one that you almost certainly would have heard of, though, is daisy chaining. And again, this is the option that most people are recommending when it comes to configuring this classic pairing, and that is you're going to have the MIDI from your computer going into the in of one module, and you're going to have another MIDI cable like this one here, connecting from the through of that module to the in of the other one. Sorry about the long cable here. So what your MIDI through does is, if you recall, I said MIDI is opto-isolated. So the MIDI through is basically echoing what is arriving on the MIDI in. But because it's opto-isolated, this module needs to be turned on. So the way I've got this set up right now, in order for the SC-55 to get any MIDI from the computer, the MT-32 has to be turned on. And if you recall when I said about the daisy chaining for the audio, the SC-55 needed to be on for the MT-32 to work. So you wouldn't do it this way, really. You would actually plug it the other way around the through from the 55 going into the MT-32, your computer's MIDI going into the SC-55. Now, if I want the MT-32 to be playing music, as with the audio, the SC-55 needs to be turned on, right, in order to hear the MT-32. That's if you were running your audio into the SC-55. That's going to need to be turned on anyway, so you may as well do your daisy chaining of the MIDI in this way. If you're not doing that for the audio, because obviously you can mix these methods, you may be using the daisy chaining of MIDI, but you might be using a mixer or something else for the audio. In which case, it seems to be most common for people to go into the MT-32 and use the through to the 55, but you can do it whichever way around you want. Now, this is scalable if you've got more than just the two modules, but every single module is going to need to have that through, or every module that is part of the chain until your very last one is going to need to have a MIDI through on it. And some of them don't. You will often get little GM modules that don't have a through. So that's not necessarily a scalable option. And so my preferred option, as per the audio options where I mentioned about a mixer, the equivalent of a mixer is kind of one of these, a MIDI through box. So what a MIDI through box does is it does the same functionality as the MIDI through, but generally to more ports, it's a separate independent box that takes its own power. This is one, there was a guy a few years back on eBay selling kits for, it was $30, touch prone MIDI through kit. I 3D printed an enclosure and made a label for on there. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to be selling them anymore, but you can still buy, you know, there are plenty of MIDI through boxes available on eBay from, you know, a 3-port, 4-port and going up from there. And yes, you can stack them together if you really want. The great thing about this is you don't need to have all of your modules turned on. So if you're running your computer MIDI into this and then your outs going out to all of your different modules, all of your modules are going to be getting the same MIDI signal whether they're turned on or not. So you can have just your MT-32 turned on when you're doing the MT-32 music, and really straightforward. The disadvantage, of course, is that this requires power. Whilst you know, I kind of said that the MIDI through box like this is the equivalent of a mixer, that's because the next step up from a basic device like this is to run a MIDI interface that also provides patch bay functionality, which is what I do. Because some of the MIDI through boxes, even secondhand, are actually getting quite pricey and into the territory of, well, you may as well be buying an old secondhand MIDI interface anyway. So what I run here is the Motu, or Mark of the Unicorn MIDI USB Micro Express. It's a MIDI interface. It's a 4-in 6-out MIDI interface, but it also works in standalone mode. So I don't need to have it connected to my Windows 10 laptop in order to operate. When I turn it on, by default, it's on the user, and this first program here, which I've set up to basically be a MIDI through unit, which means that anything received on, I think input 2 is actually getting echoed out to all of the outputs. The reason I like that is because whilst it's something else to turn on, I've got, you know, heaps of flexibility there for my personal setup and the way I work with multiple modules as well. And it's even more scalable. You can add on extra modules. They're all getting the same MIDI stream at the same time. One of the other disadvantages I should have mentioned about the daisy chaining of MIDI is theoretically you can introduce a little bit of latency, a little bit of lag. With just the classic pairing, you're really not likely to notice anything, but if you did try to do that across multiple devices, you will read online, if you read about daisy chaining MIDI devices, that eventually you're going to get some lag, introduce some latency, which, you know, when you're talking about professional music production, is really important. When you are just doing a few sound modules together for, you know, retro gaming, it's not going to matter. Theoretically, it could matter if you were daisy chaining a heap of them, and at different parts in the chain you had two GM devices that you wanted to be using simultaneously. Using a box like this, everything's going to get the same signal at exactly the same time. You're not going to have any sort of issues there. All right, so that really is, I'm starting to run out of steam here with these options. As I said, I'm going to be covering the audio mixer in more detail in the next video, so I really encourage you to watch that one as well, because I'm going to be talking about some of your options for how to get some great sound, what sort of mixers are on the market, the second-hand market, what to watch out for, a couple of little gotchas if you like, and a little trick that I actually really like for getting some fantastic sound. So I hope to catch you. As I said at the beginning, please do hit that subscribe button. Please give me the thumbs up if you like it. Got any questions, any comments, disagree with anything, let's have a chat in the comments. Love to hear from you. Bye for now.